Hi friends, good afternoon. So I want to tell you about a person who I was in my family for a long time who was a great storyteller. His name was Uncle Bill, and he lived an amazing life. He lived during the 1920s and 30s, and he would travel around on the railroads, and he actually was what they used to call a hobo. And he wasn't a hobo because he was poor or didn't have a home. He was a hobo because he loved the adventures. So when we would get together around the campfire at family reunions, he would start to tell his stories. And his stories were loud, and then they were quiet. And he would include songs about his adventures. And he would include rhymes and silly parts. And he would laugh. And we'd sit and listen for hours. In a way, he was just like the authors of your series books, except he didn't write his stories down on paper. He wrote them with his voice. You see, his stories were amazing and beautiful to listen to because of the way he told them. His voice would go up and down and get loud and soft, and it would speed up and slow down. He used his voice to make his stories come to life, to make them sound just the way the authors want them to sound. Authors have ways to help every reader bring their stories to life too, just the way my Uncle Bill did. So today I want to teach you that authors craft not just what the words they use, but also the way those words are used and placed on the page. Authors use signal in the print like bold or italic font or large type or even teeny tiny things like commas and periods to tell the reader how they want a story to sound. So readers, we're going to try a part of that in Julian's world. So I'm going to read the part of the story from the stories Julian tells without any signals, okay? So let me find it real quick. Okay, I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to read it without using any of the signals. Where is the pudding? My mother said, where are you boys? My father said. His voice went through every crack and corner of the house. We felt like two leaves in a storm. Where are you? I said. My father's voice was booming. Huey whispered to me, I'm scared. We heard my father walking slowly through the rooms. Huey, he called Julian. What do you think about that? I'm going to pause, and you can tell me about how I read that part. Yeah, that was weird, right? I mean, who's saying I'm scared, and is it I'm scared Huey, or is it I'm scared Huey, he called? It's hard to know without punctuation. And so this time I'm going to read from the story where we left off last time, so you know what's going on. And when we get to that part, I'm going to read it with a lot of feeling. So the last thing that we read was he said, it will taste like a whole raft of lemons. It will taste like a night on the sea. Then he took down a knife and sliced 5 lemons in half. He squeezed the first one. Juice squirted in my eyes. Stand back, he said, and squeezed again. The seeds flew out on the floor. Pick those seeds up, Huey, he said. Huey took the broom and swept them up. My father cracked some eggs and put the yolks in a pan and the whites in a bowl, and he rolled up his sleeves and pushed back his hair and beat up the yolks. Sugar, Julian, he said, and I poured in the sugar. He went on beating. Then he put in lemon juice and cream and set the pan on the stove. The pudding bubbled, and he stirred it fast. Cream splashed on the stove. Wipe that up, Huey, he said. Huey did. It was hot by the stove. My father loosened his collar and pushed at his sleeves. The stuff in the pan was getting thicker and thicker. He held the beater high in the air, just right, he said, and sniffed the smell of the pudding. He whipped the egg whites and mixed them into the pudding. The pudding looked softer and lighter than air. Done, he said. He washed all the pots, splashing water on the floor, and wiped the counter so fast his hair made circles around his head. Perfect, he said. Now, I'm going to take a nap. If something important happens, bother me. If nothing important happens, don't bother me. And the pudding is for your mother. Leave the pudding alone. He went into the living room and was asleep in a minute, sitting straight up in his chair. Huey and I guarded the pudding. Oh, it's a wonderful pudding, Huey said. With waves on top like the ocean, I said. I wonder how it tastes, Huey said. Leave the pudding alone, I said. If I just put my finger in there, I'll know how it tastes, Huey said. And he did it. You did it, I said. How does it taste? It tastes like a whole raft of lemons, he said. It tastes like a night on the sea. You made a hole in the pudding, I said. But since you did it, I'll have a taste. And it tasted like a whole night of lemons. It tasted like floating at sea. It's such a big pudding, Huey said. It can't hurt to have a little more. Since you took more, I'll have more, I said. That was a bigger lick than I took, Huey said. I'm going to have more again. Whoops, I said. You put in your whole hand, Huey said. Look at the pudding you spilled on the floor. I'm going to clean it up, I said. And I took the rag from the sink. It's not really clean, Huey said. It's the best I can do, I said. Look at the pudding, Huey said. It looked like craters on the moon. We have to smooth this over, I said, so it looks the way it did before. Let's get spoons. And we evened out the top of the pudding with spoons. And while we evened it, we ate some more. There isn't much left, I said. We were supposed to leave the pudding alone, Huey said. We'd better get away from here, I said. We ran into our bedroom and crawled under the bed. After a long time, we heard my father's voice. Come into the kitchen, dear, he said. I have made something for you. Why, what is it? My mother said. Out in the kitchen, under the bed, Huey and I pressed ourselves to the wall. Look, my father said out in the kitchen, a wonderful pudding. Okay, so now here comes the part where the father is going to go ahead and start talking to them. And this is the part where we read, okay? So this time I'm going to read it differently than that first time. This time I'm going to pay attention to the question marks, to where the capitals are. I'm going to pay attention to the punctuation, the commas, and all of that stuff. And instead of just ramming it all together, I'm going to read it with the way that I think the author intended. Where's the pudding? My mother said. Where are you, boys? My father said. His voice went through every crack and corner of the house. We felt like two leaves in a storm. Where are you? I said. My father's voice was booming. Huey whispered to me, I'm scared. We heard my father walking slowly through the rooms. Huey, he called. Julian! We could see his feet. He was coming into our room. He lifted the bedspread. There was his face and his eyes like black lightning. He grabbed us by the legs and pulled. Stand up, he said. We stood. Did you notice that that was different than the first time we read it? What do you have to tell me? He said. We went outside, Huey said, and when we came back, the pudding was gone. Then why were you hiding under the bed? We didn't say anything. We looked at the floor. I can tell you one thing, he said. There is going to be some beating here now. There is going to be some whipping. The curtains at the window were shaking. Huey was holding my hand. Go into the kitchen, my father said, right now. We went into the kitchen. Come here, Huey said, and I'm just going to read the rest of this so that you know how this turned out. Come here, Huey, my father said. Huey walked toward him, his hands behind his back. See these eggs, my father said. He cracked them and put the yolks in a pan and set the pan on the counter. He stood a chair by the counter. Stand up here, he said to Huey. Huey stood on the chair by the counter. Now it's time for your beating, my father said. Huey started to cry. His tears fell in with the egg yolks. Take this, my father said. My father handed him the egg beater. Now beat those eggs, he said. I want this to be a good beating. Oh, Huey said. He stopped crying and he beat the egg yolks. Now you, Julian, stand here, my father said. I stood on a chair by the table. I hope you are ready for your whipping. I didn't answer. I was afraid to say yes or no. Here, he said, and he set the egg whites in front of me. I want these whipped and whipped well. Yes, sir, I said, and started whipping. My father watched us. My mother came into the kitchen and watched us. After a while, Huey said, "This is hard work." "That's too bad," my father said. "Your beating's not done." And he added sugar and cream and lemon juice to Huey's pan and put the pan on the stove. And Huey went on beating. "My arm hurts from whipping," I said. "That's too bad," my father said. "Your whipping is not done." So I whipped, and Huey beat and beat. "Hold that beater in the air, Huey," my father said. Huey held it in the air. "See," my father said, "a good pudding stays on the beater. It's thick enough now. Your beating's done." Then he turned to me. "Let's see those egg whites, Julian," he said. They were puffed up and fluffy. "Congratulations, Julian," he said. "Your whipping's done." He mixed the egg whites into the pudding himself and then passed the pudding to my mother. "A wonderful pudding," she said. "Would you like some, boys?" "No, thank you," we said. She picked up a spoon. "Why, this tastes like a whole raft of lemons," she said. "This tastes like a night on the sea." I just wanted to make sure you knew that he wasn't actually beating those boys. They had to beat the eggs and whip the eggs so that they could remake the pudding that they ended up eating before they were supposed to. So this is what we focused on today. Use the author's punctuation and special print to bring your story to life. And so today, the way we're going to practice this is you are going to read this to me, but you are going to read it with the author's intention in mind. We're going to use the punctuation and special print to bring the story to life. Whoops, I forgot to put the quotation marks around there. So you're going to read this to me on Seesaw so that I know that you can make this story come to life. This is one of those cases where you are not going to be able to type. You will have to read this to me. I have included this text in the Seesaw lesson so you'll be able to read it right from Seesaw. I'll read it like I don't want you to read it. I can tell you one thing. He said there's going to be some beating here. Now there is going to be some whipping. That is not how his father said it. And that is not how the author intended. Make sure you put that feeling into it so I can hear the author's intention. I can't wait to hear how you read this part to me.